it would be nicer to be there. But anyway, there's a saying in Judaism, next year in Jerusalem, the next year in Pittsburgh, or maybe this year in Pittsburgh. We'll see. So the topic is early devotees, or portraits of early St. Louis devotees. And last fall, I talked about 3 early St. Louis devotees, 3 ladies. And this is a nice exercise for me. I remember visiting Albany one year on my way to Ridgely Manor, and a very wonderful Catholic nun named Sister Mary Biles, who had been in charge of the liberal arts department at Maryville University, had retired there to her mother house, and I went to see her. And after the preliminaries, you know, hi, how are you? You're looking, whatever. She said, well, she said, you might wonder what I'm doing here with nothing to do. She said, well, I decided to write my life story while I still remember it. And that's one of the things you got to watch out for as you get older. So I have these wonderful memories of these early devotees, which I didn't really consider very terribly important early on, but now I realize they are, and this helps me organize those thoughts. And it's also important, I think, for other people to hear their stories and to know what went into founding some of these American Vedanta centers. Can you all hear me all right? Okay, so I want to talk about 2 today. And I assume that at least 1 or 2 of you didn't hear the previous talk, so I want to get a little bit of background on St. Louis. St. Louis Vedanta Society was founded in 1938 by Swami Satprakashananda, who was a disciple of Swami Brahmananda and saw Swami Vivekananda 3 times as a boy in Dhaka in March of 1901. He came over here to this country on assignment to babysit Swami Akhilananda's center in Providence for a while Swami Akhilananda was in India in connection with the construction of the main temple to Sri Ramakrishna at Bellarmine. And after that time, he really didn't have an assignment. And there was a meeting of all the swamis in this country in the fall of 1938 in Southern California. The Hollywood Temple was being dedicated. And they all discussed it and decided that there was work on the East Coast and West Coast. A center recently started in Chicago, but nothing virtually in the middle of the country. Chicago was still kind of a seaport because of the St. Lawrence Seaway. So they sort of threw a dart at the map and decided St. Louis was right in the middle and you should go there. Perhaps not entirely understanding what a conservative city it was and what a hard nut it would be to crack. St. Louis was a southern city, which means that in 1938, pre-World War II, it was a very strictly segregated city. And if you weren't white, you were black. And that meant that you couldn't eat in certain places, you couldn't live in certain places, you couldn't do certain things. In 1938, there was one other person from the Indian subcontinent in St. Louis other than Swami Satprakashananda. The newspapers wouldn't even accept his paid advertisements. So this was the situation, and he didn't have a lot of money. He wasn't seated with a lot of money. It came $200 or $300 and a couple of names, someone to meet him at the station. So the people that came to him and stuck with it were really very strongly drawn to Vedanta, there was this strong inner pull, and and they had to have quite a bit of renunciation because it was quite likely that none of their friends or relatives would understand their association with this religion. So the first person that I'd like to speak of is a lady named Vera McCutcheon, Vera Faye McCutcheon. And it's interesting, Swami Satprakashananda always, as far as I know, called her Mrs. McCutcheon, a very formal way. She was my grandmother's age when I first came here. So I also called her Mrs. McCutcheon. But the ladies of her age and a little younger would call her Vera or Vera Faye. Swami Satprakashananda called her the main builder of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis. She found the building and the property that I'm sitting in as I speak to you, which was the first permanent home of the Vedanta Society and still is the home of the Vedanta Society. She was the real estate agent that conducted the sale. She gave 1/4 of the purchase price, not a loan, she gave it. And this was as a widowed mother of 2 girls. She gave 1/4 of the purchase price. And she gave what is still, after almost 70 years, the best furniture that we have in the building. And when age and infirmities did not allow her to give service anymore, she put down her memories of her time at the Vedanta Society and then collected information from other people as well. And her memoirs I'll draw on for the first part of this talk. When Mrs. McCutcheon did something, she always did it full bore, wholeheartedly. Her memoirs, it sounds simple, her memoirs that she put down as a lady in her late 70s and 80s are 148 pages of typescript. So I'll start with that and then move into my own memories of her. Okay, I'm reading from a memoir. My friend and former neighbor in St. Louis County, Mrs. Violet Trevorrow, then living in Los Angeles, California, came in May of 1949 to St. Louis to visit me, and of more importance to her, to be with Swami Satprakashananda as much time as he could spare for her. It should be mentioned that she and I had attended a few Vedanta services in February of 1942. And though Violet's karma took her to Los Angeles shortly after that, before her move, she had become Swami's confirmed devotee and in later years, an initiated disciple. My husband's death in 1939 and the resultant financial responsibilities, plus the care of 2 young daughters, confined my interest mainly to them. And after Violet's move from St. Louis, I no longer attended the Vedanta services. So her husband was a radiologist at St. Louis University Hospital. And in 1939, her younger daughter was 6, and Glenda actually became interested in Vedanta herself, and her older daughter, 8 or maybe a little older, something like that. During Violet's visit in 1939, I began attending all of Swami Satprakashananda's services again. So Vera had a car, so she took her friend to the services, but she didn't do so unwillingly. Violet had planned to spend 2 weeks with us, but near the end of her second week, Swami requested her to stay a third week, to which she happily agreed. The girls and I were happy to have her another week. She was always their Aunt Vi. And shortly before the end of the third week, after spending an afternoon with the Swami, Violet brought me the news that a woman by the name of Mrs. Ethel Kurth of Houston, Texas, was planning to come to St. Louis to see him in the very near future. Since I did not intend to continue attending the services after Violet left, and in that case would not see Mrs. Kurth, the news was of little importance. Now, I want to ask another question. You can hear me. Can you see me? Or is my name blocking me? It's okay? All right. Since I intended to quit attending services as I had in 1942, the news of Mrs. Kurth's visit was of little interest. God took it contrary-wise. The date that Violet left coincided with Swami's class night. And to my surprise, I felt a strong urge to go. The urge was heightened by my memory of the uplifting atmosphere ever present in that room and the peace and strength I had always felt in the Swami's presence. This resulted in a mental conflict between my sense of duty to my family and the urge and memory which were pulling me to class. The debate ended with my attendance in class. I started to leave after the class was over and had reached the door when Swami called me back and asked me to sit down. He told me of Mrs. Kurth's coming, of her arrival at the airport at 9 p.m. the following Saturday. He wanted me to meet her, and when I agreed, he took me to his desk and asked me to write to Mrs. Kurth. Tell her I would make hotel reservations and meet her at the airport. Before I took her to the hotel, however, he wanted me to bring her by his apartment to see him. Now, years later, when I was coming, my parents came once and met Swami Satprakashananda. And later that same day, my dad was sitting in a rocking chair in my apartment, just kind of musing. And he was rocking back and forth, and he says, "That old man has an instinct for the jugular." You see, she was on her way out. I mean, the class had won that debate, but whether it would win again, is another question. Maybe he intuited that that was the case. But in any case, he knew she had a car. He knew this lady needed to be met properly. It wasn't polite to have her take a taxi as his guest. And he knew he had this ability to read people. He knew this was a very strong-minded, capable woman who got done whatever she intended to do. So he sat her down and he told her, 1, 2, 3, 4, you do this. She, okay. How will she recognize me? Oh, that you figure it out. That's it. So he gave her a little freedom there, see, but the relationship is established. Now, Mrs. Kurth is kind of a long story. When Mrs. McCutcheon received her, she said, I don't know why I'm here. And she didn't just say it once on the way from the airport, she said it 3 times. And Mrs. McCutcheon was thinking, this woman's a little off. She flew here. People didn't fly in those days. They took the train or they drove. Flying was expensive. and she's staying in a hotel, and she doesn't know why she's here. This woman's a little off. Well, Vera ended up taking Mrs. Kurth to the center to classes. She was asked to do that as well. So again, she was attending class. And in the course of the time in the car with Mrs. Kurth, and probably taking her back to the airport, she found out that this lady had had a vision of Swami Vivekananda, and he had something happened, and that's why she came. But she didn't completely understand it. But this was a big deal for Vera. And later on, she was thinking, this is kind of the impetus that brought me in, and this was very important to her, and she put a lot of thought into it. And after this lady left, Vera asked Swami if Mrs. Kurth had told him about her vision of Swami Vivekananda. She was kind of poking. The only answer he gave was, yes. She told me that Swami Vivekananda appeared to her. He has appeared to a number of people, end quote, end of conversation. It was so completely a dismissal of the subject as far as Swami was concerned, I never mentioned it to him again. Many years later, when she wrote this memoir, she says, shortly after Mrs. Kurth left, Swami accepted my application for membership in the Vedanta Society and in due time initiated me. Until a nearly fatal illness and old age removed me from direct service, I had the blessed privilege of service to and association with my beloved Guru, an uninterrupted period amounting to more than 20 years. She continues, whether or not Mrs. Kurth's visit here and what took place before or after had anything to do with my joining the society, only God knows. Furthermore, it is no longer of any importance to me. I am now convinced that no one comes to Vedanta of his or her own volition. Rather, it is the Lord himself who brings in those who are ready to accept the teachings. So she's writing this in her maturity. Very soon after I became a member in June of 1949, Swami told me, you were brought in to get a house for the center, a permanent home for the Vedanta Society. He emphasized his statement by saying, before you can become a saint, you have to be a hero. This is a very important insight. When I came, I heard him give a Sunday talk called The Essence of the Bhagavad-Gita. And in his estimation, this was it. This was the message to Arjuna. You have to be a hero before you can be a saint. You have to stake your life for justice before you can become a saint. I realized the Swami had subtly told me that my way was karma yoga. It had the effect he evidently intended it to, by making me aware that much hard work was ahead of me on my way toward the goal, and greatly stimulated my efforts. I'm sure that Swami had no way of knowing I had a real estate license, since I had never used it, nor had I ever told him that I had it. And I thought it rather strange that without knowing this, he had assigned me the responsibility of getting a house for the center. He gave me the approximate size, arrangement, and location of the kind of house he had in mind. Relative to location, he wanted to remain in the city limits of St. Louis or near its western boundary, which on Forsyth Boulevard is less than a block west of Skinker. I knew there were many large houses in this area, and his assignment did not seem a very difficult one. At the time, I had no idea of the many deed restrictions of both the city and its subdivisions, which very often prohibited churches. Further, I had yet to learn of the extreme religious prejudice which prevailed in the city. I learned very soon through experience just how difficult these obstacles could be, and there were times when I became very discouraged. I would go to Swami and tell him, I do not think the Lord wants us to have a house, nor is he helping us. Instead of placating me, he would say very directly, you're wrong, then send me again on my search. He once said to me, the house will come, and when it does, it will be very beautiful. Sushmita Kunal, was he right or wrong? He was right. While negotiating, now I'm not going to tell the story of the purchase of the house. It was not easy, and she had a lot of things to work through as part of her karma yoga in that case, but we got it. And while the negotiations were going on for this building, Swami Saprakashananda had to have emergency surgery. It was done in March of 1952 by Dr. Roland Clemmy at Barnes Hospital, which is the main Washington University medical school hospital in St. Louis. At this time, Mrs. McCutcheon was the secretary of the center. There was people did not call long distance because it was too expensive. And she sent typewritten letters while he was in the hospital for 8 weeks to all the swamis in the country and to all the out-of-town devotees. So her friend Violet Chavarro came in for the surgery. And they were there when they wheeled the Swami out of surgery. Now, this is a letter from a devotee in Kansas City named Gladys Miller in March, later in March of 1952. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. While he was in the hospital and Violet was still in St. Louis, Mrs. McCutcheon and her friend Violet had a conversation with Dr. Clemmy, the surgeon. Dr. Clemmy joined us one morning in one of the waiting rooms of the hospital, and we had a most interesting talk with him. My sister-in-law, by chance, was nurse supervisor in charge of Swami Saprakashananda's hospital floor. She had told me that Dr. Clemmy was a very worldly person. Violet and I found him anything but. He told us that he would not charge anything for his surgery. That has to be the work of the Lord, Gladys, as you most probably know, since you're connected with the medical profession through your husband. Dr. Clemmy is a world-renowned neurosurgeon and commands very high fees for his work. Yeah, so the medical profession, by and large, is not a service profession in this country and not at major medical centers. His attitude and respect and interest in Swami leave nothing to be desired. We understood this after he told us of his love for Eastern thought and of his extensive library of it. He said a number of people had asked him about this Swami person. He simply told them, quote, "Think of Swami just as you would think of a disciple of Jesus Christ." So even in the most difficult circumstances, it seems the Lord can switch things around and make it okay. This is an excerpt from a letter that she wrote this is from an excerpt, a letter that she wrote to Swami Nikhilananda. Swami Nikhilananda is the one who had recommended this particular surgeon. "I'm happy to say that he is continuing his gradual, steady climb back to recovery. The two factors hindering his progress most are his pain and the numbness in his feet. Because of these, he's literally having to learn to walk again. The doctor said that complete freedom from pain and also the normal feeling in his feet will come with time and exercise, even though that exercise causes pain as the nerves wake up. Through pain, he will get out of pain. And let me assure you, this is indeed a very drastic remedy." So there weren't a lot of people in the center at that time, and very few automobiles that were available, and not many people that had the time and inclination to give the service that was needed to this Swami who was recovering from major surgery. So she's writing to another devotee in Kansas City. "The letter writing, which really kept my nose to the grindstone and deprived me of many an hour of much needed sleep, has lessened very considerably after Swami's return to the apartment. The Swamis in the US have either been written to by our Swami or talked to by him by long distance. As far as I'm concerned, I cannot at this time do a typewritten letter. The one I'm writing is possible only because Ruth Peterson is on leave today from work and she's cooking lunch." So Mrs. McCutcheon would cook the main meal every day for Swami. "We thought we were busy while he was in the hospital, and we did put in a great deal of time there. But what with the cooking, cleaning, and attention to Swami and rehabilitation, we are much busier now that he's home. The last thing we do at night is get everything as nearly ready for Swami's breakfast as we can. Table laid, everything ready for him. We'll even arrange things conveniently in the icebox." When she started out, there weren't refrigerators, there were ice boxes. "Then we usually end up with a foot massage, and by the time Ruth and I get home, she comes and goes by car with me. It's nearly 10 and sometimes much later. In the morning, one of us with a car tries to come as near to 10 o'clock as possible to take Swami to Forest Park. He goes to the park twice a day, so someone needs to take him to the park, pick him up from the park, bring him back to his apartment twice a day. There are only 4 cars in the center. And the way she's describing this, Vera McCutcheon picks up the slack. Well, the fact is that the other 3 ladies are not available. So she actually does all the driving, and they pick up the slack when they're free. But the way she explains it, she's picking up the slack. Also, I cook his noon meal, hence no time for letters. Yet, I reiterate, it is the most worthwhile thing I have ever done in my life. You can feel her devotion. So, let me get away from her memoirs now. I want to talk about her relationship with her guru and what she was like at the end of her life after her active years were over. The second time I came to the Vedanta Society to use the library, and I might have talked about that in a previous time, perhaps when I was there. I didn't get to use the library because the lady that was meeting me there, had gone to the hospital because Vera had just had emergency surgery. And she, after that, was no longer able to give service. She survived another maybe 17 years, but the surgery kind of changed her life. She had a lot of energy. And she said of Swami Satprakashananda, when he tells me something spiritual, I close my eyes and I just do it. But if it's secular, I'll fight him. She had a lot of fire. And when I knew him, Swami Satprakashananda would sometimes say, I like older women. They have less fire. So in those days, the main event, the main function, public function of the center centered around Ramakrishna's birth anniversary. And we had a function in the shrine for the close devotees, but we had a public function. It was the only time in the calendar year when people were invited to have a sumptuous lunch of Indian cuisine following the service. It was a big deal. You know, there might be as many as 100 people, which was a lot in those days. And Swami had taught the American ladies, and there were some Indian ladies also there, how to cook these dishes. And they would come to the center and cook the day before on that Saturday. So this was in the works. And there's a back stairway from the kitchen, from one of the kitchen doors to the second floor. So Mrs. McCutcheon was at the bottom of the stairway and Swami was at the top of the stairway, and she was bringing something to his attention regarding the Ramakrishna dinner. So he had this ingenious, I would say, way of just frustrating him with his hearing impediment. He did have a hearing impediment, but you know, you'd say something and he'd heard you before and he'd say, huh, and then, so this was going on, something about the Ramakrishna dinner. He said, huh, something about the, huh. So she keeps ramping up the volume, slowing down, becoming, you know, articulating more clearly. And she's talking about the Ramakrishna dinner. And he looks down and he says, in the kitchen? Well, this was too much for her. She was steamed by this point. And she says, Ramakrishna, 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 as she stomped off in anger. So this is how her guru got her to say the name of her chosen ideal with great energy and enthusiasm. And anyone else that was there that day also remembers it with great energy and enthusiasm. You know what happens when a lot of ladies get together and they're doing something, all this chatter starts, okay? And this was, of course, happens, our kitchen is very small, and they're all crammed in there and they're talking about this and that, and Swami would come through and the you know, things would, the twittering would kind of settle down, and he'd say, the only thing he'd say is 3 words, say your mantras. So anyway, that he got her to do that. So I said, Vera was fiery. She had the nature of a kshatriya. You didn't want to get on Vera's bad side. Once you got on Vera's bad side, you didn't get back on the other side. She was a strong-minded lady. And after she'd retired, we have a clear channel radio station in St. Louis that was talk radio at that time. She'd monitor the radio. And if anyone got on the air and said something that was inaccurate or untoward about Hinduism, she'd get on the phone and she'd get on the air and she would set the world straight. She was a defender of the faith. And she was kind of a wounded Christian, what Houston Smith would call a wounded Christian. As I said, if you got on her bad side, you were there permanently. I mean, and she'd rail about it sometimes. Even that, though that isn't our outlook, we have an acceptance outlook. That was Vera. Okay, we come to Vedanta with our excellences and defects, and this was Vera. She was, you couldn't ask for a more loyal friend, but if things turned the other way, watch out. Now, we had a young man here, brahmachari from Indiana in the 70s, and he somehow inadvertently got on her bad side. He didn't know what he'd done. He had no idea how that had happened. But he understood that something had happened, and he wasn't happy with it. This was an untoward event, but it didn't seem like he could do anything about it. Now, even though she wasn't at the center giving service, she was still a big presence there. She'd come to services and so forth. And when she got too old and feeble to climb stairs, she wanted to come one last time to the center and bow down in the shrine. This was after Swami Satprakashananda had passed away. She was in her 80s. It wasn't too long after that she passed away. So since she couldn't climb the stairs, we found a very sturdy but not too heavy armchair. And this other brahmachari and I carried her upstairs to the second floor. She was able to get out, bow down. We carried her back downstairs. She got in her car. The other brahmachari stayed next to the car. The window was open. And he gave his best pitch to make amends. He talked to her for a while, very sweetly. And she's this skinny, kind of frail woman, looking at him, paying attention to every word he says through the window. And he's kneeled down, they're eye to eye. And he finishes and she says, "We like the other monk. No sale." Well, things went on. Glenda, her daughter, her younger daughter. And I might mention, there was a lot of renunciation that was required of some of these devotees. I mean, her husband was a doctor. She had this big house in the county. And her older daughter married very well into a prominent St. Louis family. And the older daughter said, "As long as you're involved like this with the Vedanta Society, I can't have anything to do with you." She disowned her. I never heard anything about this from Vera. I heard it from other people. It's like she just let it go. So anyway, she was living with Glenda. Glenda had a full-time job as a legal secretary, and her mother required more and more care. So it got to the point where it was too much. Glenda found a nursing home, and Vera went there. And Miss McCutcheon had a very elaborate procedure for how she retired at night. There'd be a mask that she wore, and there's certain things that needed to be done in a certain order. And Glenda explained this to the people, and they said, "That'll be no problem. We'll do that exactly as she wishes. It'll be fine." So the next morning, Glenda was thinking about this big change in her life, this big change in her mother's life, wondering how it went at the nursing home when the phone rang. It's the nursing home. "Glenda, you can come pick up your mother. We can't handle her." Vera McCutcheon had a lot of fire, even when she was just skin and bones. "We can't handle her." Well, things went on, and Glenda hired some people and kept her there, but eventually she had to put her back in the same place. And this time it worked. And one of the devotees here had gone out to see her. And I had joined by then. I was a monk. And Bob said, you have to go out and see Mrs. McCutcheon. I said, why? He says, you got to go see her. He says, just do it. Make the time and do it. You've got to see her. So I went out there. She was in a room with 2 other people, and completely cognizant, clear-headed, as she always was. And after just a bit of preliminaries, she looks at me, and with all that energy and fire that she always had, she says, all I see everywhere is love. And she repeated it. All I see everywhere is love. And you could feel it. I mean, she was in another space. And that's why Bob sent me out there. You can't explain, you have to be there. So I got back and I started calling devotees who I thought would appreciate being able to see her in this condition. And many of them did. Some of them couldn't find time in their busy schedules, and that was their loss. And they remember to this day that state that she was in. And we tried to get that monk to go out there and see her. And Tom didn't want to go. He'd given his best pitch, and it had fallen flat, and he didn't feel like putting himself out there again and getting knocked down. And somehow we convinced him, you need to go, just do it. And he went out there. And that was all washed away, as if it never happened. That love encompassed this young man as well. All I see everywhere is love. She didn't last too long after that. She died shortly thereafter. I don't remember the exact time frame. And I don't know how long that state lasted exactly. That was the last time I saw Vera. But she and Vera, let's see, her daughter and Wanda Ellis, another very close devotee who's still alive, were with her when she died. She died very peacefully. So this is, I guess, to say that for me, fairly early on, this was an inspiration. This works. Doesn't just work for monks, it works for devotees. You know, this is an ordinary woman, you know, a widow with 2 kids, regular American. And it was as if the exuberant love that she had for her guru became all pervading. It was and is inspiring. So 6:45, Susmita, how much longer do I have here? I can't hear you. Your microphone's off.
Yeah, you can go on, Maharaj. We are here.
Okay. All right. So the second devotee is William Berninger. He is never called William, always called Bill. And he came in September of 1953 with his younger brother, Bob. And he did not come because he was interested in Vedanta. He came because his brother was interested. At this time, Bill was about 36 and Bob was about 34. Now, the younger brother, Robert or Bob, got interested, well, first you have to be kind of disillusioned with duality, and then you find the spiritual teachings. So the sequence is this. He was a radio gunner in a B-24 bomber in World War II, stationed first in Tunisia, fighting Rommel's troops, and then as the war progressed, stationed in Sicily, bombing Italy, then stationed in Italy, bombing Germany. And and serving many, many combat missions beyond the number that you're supposed to serve before you're sent back stateside for rest and relax and recreation, so that you don't get combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress syndrome. So Bob had definite spiritual inclinations from the beginning, and he was just torn up because he couldn't reconcile the teachings of Christianity, the teachings of Christ, for instance, on the Sermon on the Mount, turn the other cheek, resist not evil. He couldn't reconcile these direct teachings of God incarnate with fighting this war. And it bothered him during the war, after the war. And then he found a copy of Swami Prabhavananda's translation of the Bhagavad-Gita. And this dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna was like the light. He says, yeah, he says, that's it. And he told his brother, his older brother, and their parents were both dead, that he was going to go to Southern California to move there and find Swami Prabhavananda and learn what he could. So the last thing that Bill wanted was for his only sibling and closest friend to leave town for California. So he said, well, listen, Bob, I mean, St. Louis is a big city. Maybe there's a Vedanta group here. Let's see if we can find it. Well, this was 1953. They got the house in 1952. So they were in the phone book. So they looked it up one Saturday morning, and the next Saturday morning, they drove over there. They came up to the front yard. There's a signboard in front. It mentions the title of the talk and the speaker. The guest speaker this morning, that particular for the next day on Sunday, was Swami Prabhavananda from Southern California. So they knew they had the right place. Now that morning, Bob had earlier gotten a traffic ticket for running a red light. It was one of those, and this is Maya experiences. He was behind this big, enormous, slow-moving truck. And as the slow-moving truck, which blocked his view of the stoplight, was moving through the intersection, it turned red. And the cop that was at right angles, gave him a ticket. And he was steamed. He was angry. And he was still angry when they pulled up and saw that Swami Prabhavananda was there. And he told his older brother, he says, look, I don't think it's appropriate to meet a Swami when you're angry. Why don't you go up and see if you can talk with him? So Bill went up, and both Swamis came out on the porch and talked with him. And after Bill left, Swami Prabhavananda told Swami Satprakashananda, that man we just talked to is an alcoholic. And he was. Bill was a trumpeter, a jazz musician, and a very good one. In fact, his brother Bob, I got most of this information from his brother because he was his closest friend, and Bill confided pretty much everything to him. Bob said that he was a jazz trumpeter, and some of his fellow musicians had told Bob that Bill was very good jazz musician. He said, in fact, Bill doesn't know how good he is. He doesn't realize it. When he goes on a solo, on an improvisation, I call it a riff, he's as good as anybody. But he gets self-conscious and he'll pull it back. He said, but he's as good as anyone that you know that's playing a trumpet. But the lifestyle is such that they're in places that serve alcohol, and many of them get addicted to it because they love the music, and after hours they'll keep playing, and then socially they'll drink, and before you know it, they're alcoholics. So I'm going to draw on Mrs. McCutcheon's memoir here. Pardon me. She said they attended the service the next morning, joined the society shortly thereafter, and at once started their routine of service to the center. One of the first and more difficult jobs they performed jointly was the elimination of the wilderness in the backyard. Other than a small crabapple tree near the kitchen, this wilderness of bushes, mostly honeysuckle, little bushes under big bushes, literally covered the yard. They didn't stop at cutting down the bushes, but dug out the roots when all of this was done, brought sod and spread it over the yard. Then they made flower beds outlined with the bricks they got from buildings, old buildings that were torn down in St. Louis. And seeing the yard now as it looks today, it would be hard to imagine what it looked like when the property was bought. About the time that Bill and Bob came in 1953, Bill had a part-time job and was often able to spend a full workday at the society. He painted the outside woodwork of the society's building and did many other jobs. So after he became a full-time employee, daytime employee, then he just gave service when he could. And he lived in the basement of the center. There was a hookup for a gas stove, and there was an extra gas stove and refrigerator that a devotee donated. So Bill and Bob partitioned off some rooms down there, and he lived there for about 5 years and really helped out when the society didn't have a lot of people that could actually give that kind of hands-on service. As I said, he was an alcoholic, and sometimes he'd get into trouble. I assume it was because he was driving and intoxicated, and he'd end up in jail. And Mrs. McCutcheon would always go down and bail him out. Some of the ladies looked down on this. And again, she was a strong person. She says, look, he's a good person and he's a good worker and we need him. So I don't know how long this went on. Let's see, what are my notes here? Oh yeah. But at some point, Bill had enough of the alcohol, and he went to Swami and asked for help. Can you help me get rid of this habit? And Swami got real quiet and real serious, and he said, do you really want to quit? Do you really want to quit? Think about it. And if you really want to quit, come back. So there was some time lapse, and he came back, yes, I really want to quit. And again, he said, you sure you want to quit? Yes. He says, okay. Swami says, okay. That was the end of the interview. Well, these habits don't die so easily. The next time he took a drink, he just felt so terrible. Just felt so awful. Now, Bill didn't tell me this, Bob did. He felt so awful. Oh my God. And he wasn't tempted to drink for a very long time after that. Second time he took a drink, he felt so bad he thought he was going to die. And that stayed with him. That was it. He never wanted to drink again. It was over. So he never talked about this with me directly, but he did tell me that he was sure that he was the only person in St. Louis who had a picture of Girish Chandra Ghosh on his shrine altar. So now, Bill was very quiet and very proper. He always came to services early and in a suit and tie with his hair just right, parted and perfect, every hair in place. Had a job as a library assistant at Olin Library, and I'd see him sometimes and his brother, who also worked there, on break. I was a student at the time and coming to the center, so I knew who they were, but they didn't see me. I'd see him coming on break, going from the library to the coffee shop, and Bill would be talking to Bob. Bob always had this like half smile on his face, like the world was amusing to him. Very even temperament. And Bill would be telling some story and he'd be moving his arms and moving around. And, you know, so Bill was Rajasic and Bob was very, very sattvic. So a little bit about my interaction with Bill. Bill was always there in some way when something needed to be done. Either he helped out and did it, or he understood your feeling state and he'd do something, he'd intervene and kind of get things settled down. Very quietly, he was a very wonderful and copacetic presence. So, and he was in his 60s sometime, and he got lung cancer, oat cell cancer, which is very aggressive, and was hospitalized. And one of the young men was an intensive care unit down at the university, a nurse down at the hospital, and went down there and read his chart when he was in the hospital. And it said he had something, they couldn't really treat it properly, and there was nothing more they can do. They were going to send him home. Well, the doctors weren't very forthcoming, and they sent him home, but they didn't tell him they sent him home to die. So he went back, took his job part-time at the university, started giving service at the center, and we were all,
George, in the mail today from Dharmadas, it's the lecture for Sunday.
No.
No.
Yeah. So this is the young man here that read the chart at the bottom of Bill's bed. This is George. Say hi, George.
Hi.
But Bill didn't know, so he went back to work and started giving service at the center. But the younger people, especially, were all a little on edge. Who didn't quite know how to act around Bill now that he'd had cancer and might not live too long and all this. So we were cleaning up after lunch one day, and I was drying the dishes or rinsing the dishes, and Bill was drying them. And he's a little shorter than I am, so he's next to me. He says, I wonder if I could, I won't use it for very long. I just need it for a while. I wonder if you have an old bucket around here that I could use. Doesn't have to be a good bucket. Doesn't even have to hold water. I said, oh, Bill, we got plenty of buckets. We'll get you a good bucket. He says, no, it doesn't have to be. And I'll give it back. He said, well, you can keep the bucket. No. He says, I just need it for a while. I need to practice kicking the bucket. That's like plucking potal. It means you're going to practice dying. So he'd pull this gag on everyone he could, and we all relaxed around. He was just such an unusual person. So he wasn't concerned about the fact that he had cancer. And it eventually ended up back in the hospital. And one of the doctors comes in, and it's the oncologist. And he says, Bill, I have good news. Your cancer's in remission. We can send you home. Everything's looking really good. And Bill says to him, he says, what about that other doctor who was in here just now who said that the chemotherapy had shut down my liver and my liver isn't working? Oh, I'll have to check into that. You know, how things get sometimes in hospital. So he had this remarkable equanimity in that condition. One of the younger doctors, a lady, came in, and she didn't quite know how to handle the situation. So he wanted to make her feel more at ease, and he complimented on her, the way she had accessorized that day, her scarf or whatever, how she put her clothing on, just like, you know, he wasn't in the hospital and dying, just like that, set her at ease. And his brother Bob went down there to see him and asked him if he remembered, you know, if he was saying his mantra, if he remembered Ramakrishna and Holy Mother and Swami Vivekananda. And Bill says, oh, he says they were just here. I just saw him, just very nonchalantly. So you don't know whether that was the medication he was taking that was kind of helping out with that. And Bob didn't take it too seriously. But the last time I saw him, I went down there with Swami Chaitananda. When he was released from the hospital, he went home to die. And one of our members, who was a retired RN, stayed with him and took care of him until he died. But this was in the hospital just before he released. And, you know, I was the driver. I'd go along with Swami Chaitananda. He knew what to do in those situations. I hadn't joined that, and I joined in 81. This was 82. But I felt like it was incumbent upon me now that I was a monk to do something spiritual, but I wasn't really sure what that might be. But I didn't want to leave. So Swami had left already. And I was just trying to figure out what to do. And Bob was in the hospital bed. It was kind of propped up a little bit, you know, the back of it props up. So he's seated in bed, and he asked me to sit down on the bed. So we're eye to eye. I'm sitting on the bed. He looks at me and he says, either I'll get better or I'll get worse. And either way, it's okay. And he pats me on the shoulder, and I say, thanks, Bill. He had no fear of death. He had such peace of mind. He was such a benign presence in that situation. And I found my contact with both of these devotees to be very inspiring. I mean, anyone, no matter, I mean, the teachings are there, no matter where you start. If you take this seriously, if you practice it, if it's the rice and dal or the meat and potatoes on your plate rather than the garnish, you will have definite positive change, and it will be, nothing is lost. I mean, that all stays with you. So that's my talk.